History as It Happens, May 5th, 2026. Paul Kennedy's Prophecy.
We, the people, starting the third century of a dream, standing up to some cynic who's trying to tell us we're not going to get any better. Are we at the end?
But America is not in decline. America is a rising nation.
And it's not the $2 trillion debt. It's the terrible prospect by 1990 of our deficit being $3 trillion.
Japan comes over to this country, they're buying up Wall Street, they're buying up all of Manhattan's real estate. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it.
This is the recurring image of the Japanese industrial success. Cars like these have forced the Americans to concede first place to the Japanese as the world's top car manufacturers.
We stand tonight before a new world of hope and possibilities for our children. A world we could not have contemplated a few years ago.
When the United States seemed to be at the pinnacle of global power as the Cold War came to an end, as the internet boom fueled a new decade of economic growth, a wise historian was warning of imperial overstretch and relative decline. 40 years later, we can say Paul Kennedy was right. That's next as we report History as It Happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We ought to ask this question about relating ends and means in a very thorough way, every so often, and for one profound reason, that the world outside is constantly changing.
So in the early 80s, I think Paul was very well known among historians and among foreign policy specialists, but this book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, really burst him into the public consciousness, and he was mentioned by President Bush and by others.
We can also be heartened by our progress across the world. Most important, America is at peace tonight.
Early 1987, Ronald Reagan delivers his State of the Union address with his usual sunny optimism about where America was heading.
Well, I can't tell it any better than the real thing. A story recorded by James Madison from the final moments of the Constitutional Convention, September 17th, 1787. As the last few members signed the document, Benjamin Franklin, the oldest delegate at 81 years and in frail health, looked over toward the chair where George Washington daily presided. At the back of that chair was painted the picture of a sun on the horizon. And turning to those sitting next to him, Franklin observed that artists found it difficult in their painting to distinguish between a rising and a setting sun. Well, I know if we were there, we could see those delegates sitting around Franklin, leaning in to listen more closely to him. And then Dr. Franklin began to share his deepest hopes and fears about the outcome of their efforts. And this is what he said: "I have often looked at that picture behind the president without being able to tell whether it was a rising or setting sun. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun."
Also in 1987, a British historian who taught at Yale named Paul Kennedy wrote a surprise bestseller, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, in which he wrote, "Although the United States is at present still in a class of its own economically and perhaps even militarily, it cannot avoid confronting the two great tests which challenge the longevity of every major power that occupies the number one position in world affairs. Whether in the military strategical realm it can preserve a reasonable balance between the nation's perceived defense requirements and the means it possesses to maintain those commitments, and whether, as an intimately related point, it can preserve the technological and economic basis of its power from relative erosion in the face of the ever-shifting patterns of global production." So aligning means with ends was a major theme of Kennedy's work, and in the 1980s, the national debt exploded. Unlike today, members of both parties in Congress would talk about it.
You know what bothers me the most, my colleagues, is that it isn't the $1 trillion debt, and it's not the $2 trillion debt. It's the terrible prospect by 1990 of our deficit being $3 trillion. And the interest or carrying charge on that debt isn't going to be 1/9 of our current fiscal budget. It's going to be 1/5 of the budget by 1990.
The economic plan that we're following has doubled the national debt in 4 years, and that we are not willing to do what is really necessary to bring the budget into balance and keep it there, and it's a massive sham.
The year after the publication of his book in 1988, Professor Kennedy testified before a congressional committee about the inevitable challenges awaiting the United States as its global power relative to other countries diminished.
So, at the economic and technological level, I'm submitting that the world has changed greatly since 1950. But what has not changed is the absolute array of commitments and obligations which we have to NATO, to Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, and new commitments in the Middle East. The United States' relative share of world power is less than it was 40 years ago. Its absolute commitments have not shrunk. And that, I think, brings us back briefly to the question of ends and means, of closing the gap between our commitments and our capacities.
On the campaign trail that year, George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, mentioned the book. And as historian Jeffrey Engel notes in When the World Seemed New, his history of the Bush presidency, the candidate publicly rejected the notion the U.S. was in decline. That kind of talk was for his weak Democratic opponent, Michael Dukakis.
There is a profound difference between me and my opponent in this election, a difference not only of policies, but really of fundamental values.
Yet, as Engel notes, the country Bush was elected to lead appeared, according to Kennedy's quantifiable measures, a classic example of an empire afflicted by overstretch. Its military knew no immediate rival, yet its treasury was empty, and its factories faced stiff competition from abroad, in particular from those whose most recent investments had flourished under the very shadow of American protection. Engel goes on to say James Baker knew enough to be worried, noting before leaving his post as Treasury Secretary in 1988 to run Bush's campaign that the scope of the national security debate has been broadened to include the economic dimension.
My opponent's view of the world sees a long, slow decline for our country, an inevitable fall, mandated by impersonal historical forces. But America is not in decline. America is a rising nation.
So I thought of Paul Kennedy's big book, which I read about 10 years ago, because of what's happening now in the United States and in the Middle East. Imperial overstretch. The U.S. could not defend its bases in the Persian Gulf from Iranian attack. And now the Trump administration, in all its incompetence, is asking for hundreds of billions more for defense without raising taxes, as the national debt soars toward $40 trillion. It was about $3 trillion when Reagan left office. Speaking of the Middle East, in his 1987 book, Paul Kennedy, who is now 80 years old and still teaches at Yale, noted all of those decades ago that the Middle East has been viewed as requiring constant American attention, whether of a military or a diplomatic kind. Yet, he says, the memory of the 1979 debacle in Iran and of the ill-fated Lebanon venture of 1983, the diplomatic complexities of the antagonisms and the unpopularity of the United States among the Arab masses all make it extremely difficult for an American government to conduct a coherent, long-term policy in the Middle East.
And the strategic purpose behind the terrorism sponsored by these outlaw states is clear: to disorient the United States, to disrupt or alter our foreign policy, to sow discord between ourselves and our allies. In short, to cause us to retreat, retrench, to become Fortress America. Yes, their real goal is to expel America from the world.
So with us now to discuss Paul Kennedy's prophecy is one of his old students, historian Jeremi Suri, an expert on U.S. foreign policy at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the co-host of This Is Democracy podcast and the Democracy of Hope newsletter on Substack. Tap subscribe now in the show notes to skip ads, get early access, and enjoy all of our bonus content. Or go to historyasithappens.com.
Hey there, it's Wayfair here, where delivery and setup are as easy as a few taps on your phone. You're relaxing in an old hammock, scrolling Wayfair's app, when you spot it, a brand new patio set. Next thing you know, Wayfair delivers it right to your patio and sets it up. Oh, you need a new grill too? All right, Wayfair's got you covered. With Wayfair's room of choice delivery and fast expert setup on qualifying orders, life gets a little easier. Visit Wayfair.com or the Wayfair app.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
Jeremi Suri, welcome back, my friend.
Good to be with you, Martin.
You know, I've done so many episodes about the war in Iran, the historical origins, Middle East, Israel, Palestine over the past 2 months. I feel like all those episodes were leading to this conversation, which could be titled, The Emperor Has No Clothes, but I'm going with Paul Kennedy's prophecy. Tell us, who is Paul Kennedy?
So Paul Kennedy is, I think, one of the monumentally important historians of international relations, of great power politics, of empire, monumentally important in the work he's done over the last 50 to 70 years. And it's an incredible opus. He's most famous for his book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, but he published some of the most important work on Anglo-German rivalries before World War I, some of the most important work on the history of the British Navy that's very relevant for thinking about the U.S. Navy today, work on grand strategy, work on British imperialism, and work on American foreign policy as well. And he's probably best known for integrating economics with an understanding of military power and understanding international societies and how they interrelate to one another. Paul also trained many of us in the field. I think there's a very large group of us who are historians today because of Paul. He was our teacher and remains our teacher in many ways.
So before the mid to late 1980s, when this book came out, did anyone really know in the United States who Paul Kennedy was? Because the president of the United States mentioned him in this period, referring to Bush, George H.W. Bush, after he won election in late 88.
So in the early 80s, I think Paul was very well known among historians and among foreign policy specialists. But this book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, really burst him into the public consciousness. And he was mentioned by President Bush and by others, discussed on the floor of the U.S. Senate, because he predicted that the United States, or he analyzed at least, that the United States was in jeopardy of going into decline. And many politicians wanted to argue against that and were offended, quite frankly, that he made that argument.
How dare you say we're in decline? We are the world superpower. Although the Cold War was still happening, 86, 87, Gorbachev has only been on the scene for a short time. His reforms are taking hold, and it's not clear at all that the Soviet Union is going to be gone when this book comes out.
That's true, though the rival for the United States in this book is Japan, not the Soviet Union. He sees the Soviet Union as the strategic counterweight to the United States. But Paul's argument, and this is evident from the original cover, which I have here, the Japanese challenging the United States because of, at that time, their greater economic productivity. This is the time when Japanese vehicles are outperforming as quality vehicles. This is when the Japanese economy, Sony and various other companies seem to be doing so much better than American companies. And most significantly, the United States seems basically mired in debt and unable to cover the costs of managing its large presence around the world.
I want to return to that issue. The fact that the United States was drowning in debt. But about Japan, that's one prediction. He's not alone there. That didn't work out. He said that China and Japan would be the two capital G, capital P, great powers.
No, but Japan really was a very influential, powerful country in the 1980s.
Yeah, economically. All those novels that came out about how Japan's taking over. But go ahead.
Yeah. And not just economically, though, also in terms of foreign aid. Much of the foreign aid that flowed in the 1980s and still does into countries in Southeast Asia, other parts of the world actually come from Japan. And so Japan was using foreign aid in addition to economic activity to build influence in different parts of the world.
Economy's been stagnant for a while now.
Well, that's not something Paul predicted. Sure. That's right.
Well, I'm reading from our friend Jeffrey Engel's book here. I'll move on to Paul Kennedy's book in a second. But he cites how the Mitsubishi Group in late 1989 bought Rockefeller Center in New York. And I do remember a book that came out, Michael Crichton, Rising Sun. There was a movie about that too with Sean Connery.
From the #1 bestseller, Sean Connery.
You should know I'm a black belt, but of course you are there.
Wesley Snipes.
Don't lose your temper. I don't lose my temper.
even Donald Trump used to talk about Japan in those days.
But we don't have free trade right now, because if you want to go to Japan or if you want to go to Saudi Arabia or various other countries, it's virtually impossible for an American to do business in those countries.
So actually, it's an interesting story. When Paul Kennedy's book came out, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, alongside another bestseller, which was The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump.
Yeah, it was a surprise bestseller. I mean, think today, how often does a 600, 700-page history book become a bestseller?
I keep trying. It's not. It's really hard to do.
I haven't tried. So, the end of his book, he has a chapter in the conclusion. The United States, the problem of number one in relative decline. Jeremy, tell us why this was so provocative.
So it was a startling argument, not because it was new. In fact, many who had lived through the 1970s, including people like Ronald Reagan, were fearful that we had entered decline during the years of stagflation, an oil crisis. This should all sound familiar to people.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will.
What was different from Paul's argument was he made the case that structurally, over the course of history, that empires and large great powers like the United States, they rise and they fall. And in some ways, this is something you can't reverse. You can do better in managing it, but you cannot reverse it. Others who thought we had been in decline, like Ronald Reagan, wanted to argue that we could reverse decline with the right policies, with a stronger military. And the argument within American politics in the 80s was how to reverse decline. And what Paul was saying in his book was, if you put us in the context of the British Empire in the 19th century and the Habsburg Empire of the 17th century, you know, we are entering a similar period when we're going to be in decline, and there's really nothing we can do to reverse it. We just have to manage it. That's not what the Reagan people wanted to hear.
Now, there are those in our land today, however, who would have us believe that the United States, like other great civilizations of the past, has reached the zenith of its power, that we're weak and fearful, reduced to bickering with each other, and no longer possessed of the will to cope with our problems. Much of this talk has come from leaders who claim that our problems are too difficult to handle. We're supposed to meekly accept their failures as the most which can humanly be done. They tell us we must learn to live with less and teach our children that their lives will be less full and prosperous than ours have been.
Relative decline. The first word in that term is the most important.
All international politics is relative because it's about your power in relationship to others. And the United States benefited after World War II from this extraordinary gap in its power and the rest of the world, including the Soviet Union. One of the things Paul has shown in a subsequent book is how much larger the U.S. Navy was than all the other navies in the world coming out of World War II. Something like 7,000 ships we had. We only have like 300 ships today. And so that gap, which gave us the ability to open markets and the ability to ensure security in so many areas of the world, even though we had a rival in the Soviet Union, that relative gap had closed. And certainly economically, the Japanese were getting very close to us and what we could do.
It has to close, right? You can't have a static situation where the United States is that much more powerful than everybody else. The problem, I guess, is when you don't pull back then from your security commitments.
The really brilliant part of Paul's book is to recognize exactly what the causal factor is there. And he articulates it better than anyone had before and anyone has since, which is that what happens when you're a huge relative power like the United States is you start spending more and more of your resources on maintaining that empire that you've built. And a country like Japan, which is an ally, which does not have to invest in maintaining a large empire, can actually focus its smaller resources on more productive activities. And those more productive activities allow that country in the long run to outperform the larger country that is spending resources on more things. Paul called this imperial overstretch.
I was just about
and his argument was because the United States was so big, it had overstretched itself in its commitments. Japan was not overstretched, so it was able to invest in production companies and in various other things that allowed it to produce more economic growth.
You took the words out of my mouth. Imperial overstretch. Let's talk about the debt in those days, because we think back to the 1980s, or maybe some people do, and remember it for a better time than it actually was. Kennedy brought this up in his book. Our friend Jeff Engel has brought it up as well in his scholarship about the George H.W. Bush presidency. That president was left with a terrible bill to pay. The 1980s weren't as prosperous and as great as the Reaganites would want us to believe. Can you address that, Jeremy, and how it relates to this conversation about too much debt, too much overextension?
Overall, the American GNP grew during the second half of the 1980s. The early part of the 80s saw actually a terrible recession, and particularly in 1981 and 1982, with unemployment that reached up to 10% in the United States. So it depends, which part of the 80s we're talking about. Two things, though, that are significant that come out in Paul's book. Many of the investments the United States was making to fuel economic growth were in areas that were not always productive for the economy as a whole. So military spending is a way of creating jobs, and it is a stimulus of a sort, but it doesn't stimulate and filter into all of American society. And so what we saw in the 1980s and continue to see in the United States are wages that stagnate for those in the middle. So those who have access, those who work for management consulting companies that consult for the Pentagon do very well. Many of those are my students. But those who don't have a fancy education and are working in ordinary jobs in small towns and elsewhere, even in large cities, their wages stagnate relative to the cost of living. And so they're not actually living better. And this has been the case since the 1970s. That's a point that Paul gets at because it's a matter of what you're investing in. The second issue is the debt issue. As the United States borrows more, and during the Reagan years, the United States begins this upward trajectory in indebtedness, and that we have now reached the point under Donald Trump today, it just happened a few days ago, where our indebtedness now exceeds our annual GNP. It's 100% of our GNP. It was never that high since 1946. This begins with the Reagan years at a lower scale. And that indebtedness, according to Kennedy's argument, raises the cost of capital. So it means that when you need to borrow more money to build new factories, to invest in innovation, it becomes more expensive. And that crowds out innovation and investment. That's exactly the problem that other empires had before. The more you borrow, the more you have to pay to borrow. The more you're paying to borrow, the less money you then have to invest in other things. Today, in the U.S. budget, I think $1 out of every $7 goes to paying interest on the debt. So that's $1 out of $7, every $7 that we're not using as investment, but we're instead using to pay the Chinese or whoever else holds our debt.
The industrial base, he mentions how that is starting to fritter away. That's, I hate using the term inevitable, but in global capitalism and a globalized economy, it was a matter of time before labor starts or capital starts looking for cheaper sources of labor outside the U.S. and factory jobs. We have this maybe nostalgia for the factory job and the boom, the quarter century after the end of the Second World War, 1945 to 1970. That is actually not the norm. That's not the norm, right? And it was just inevitable that those jobs are going to start migrating to other parts of the world. So one other note about the Soviet Union before we go to the U.S. In his final paragraph about the Soviet Union as of the mid-'80s, he says, "Those who rejoice at the present-day difficulties of the Soviet Union and look forward to the collapse of that empire might wish to recall that such transformations normally occur at very great cost and not always in a predictable fashion," saying that the collapse of the USSR, if and when it happens, is going to be very violent. That process is still playing out in what I call, and really Michael Kimmage, our friend, has introduced to me this term, the wars of Soviet succession, still happening.
Old empires don't go away, they decline, but as they decline, they leave lots of scar tissue around them. And that's true with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is part of the story of World War I. And it's certainly true with the Soviet Empire, which is the story of the war in Ukraine now. Vladimir Putin is trying to salvage the Soviet Empire, and Ukraine is the victim of that effort.
How do you view decline? Is it apparent only in retrospect? Can you detect it while it's underway?
I think you can. I mean, as a historian, and this is, again, Paul's own work shows this, people within the society see it happening as it happens. But I also think, and this is really, if you read Paul's work carefully, what you realize is that although decline might be somewhat inevitable, it can be a very slow process and it can be an uneven process. So you can be an overall decline, but still have moments when you don't reverse the decline, but you find other areas of achievement. That's sort of where Paul Kennedy comes together with Henry Kissinger, because this is also Kissinger's view that the United States could not maintain the gap in power that it had benefited from for so long, but it could do things to create new situations of power, new situations of strength. And to some extent, that's what happens after the 1980s, right? The growth of Silicon Valley and Austin, where I live, Route 128, and digital technology gives the United States another bump, at least for a while. We're seeing now that bump actually makes us dependent on places like Taiwan for microchips.
Yeah.
But there are ways in which, in the process of relative decline, there can be new sources of power that emerge, but you have to be willing to invest in those. And the challenge today, applying Paul's project to today, would be that we are actually not making those investments. If we say we want to put $1.5 trillion into the military, which would be more than 50% more than we already invest in the largest military in the world, at a time when we're in more debt than we've ever been, that money is coming from investments in human capital and investments in other capital that are necessary for our future sustenance. It's eating our seed corn, which is exactly what he predicts.
We can't have guns and butter.
And we cannot just keep building the same old guns when the Iranians and others are showing us that our fancy guns are susceptible to the smaller drones, the smaller, cheaper ones that they've built.
Yeah, who would have thought that the breakthrough in military innovation, a $50,000 drone?
So this now brings, the work on disruption from Clay Christensen and others. And this is always what happens, right? I mean, Sony, the great Japanese electronic company of the 1980s, they end up getting undermined, right, by smaller Korean electronic companies that make stuff less expensively, that's lower quality, but far less expensive, and people want to buy the less expensive stuff.
How about that?
And that's exactly what's happening now.
Well, it's a rerun from the 80s when you could buy an American television. When was the last time you bought an American what's an American television? What's an American radio? What's an American stereo?
Have you noticed how inexpensive televisions are now, too? I mean, it's amazing, right? I mean, that's the whole point, right? We have this beautiful, expensive military, and we're going to spend more and more on it, but it's being undermined by these cheap militaries. All they need to do in the Strait of Hormuz is damage a few ships, and they've shut it down.
Geography remains undefeated. I mean, that's an issue then, it's an issue today.
So this is another important point in Paul's work, the geopolitics, and he did a lot of work on Halford Mackinder.
The Eurasian landmass,
the heartland, as Mackinder called it, really prominent and important British intellectual of the early 20th century who wrote about these issues. Paul's work shows, especially in The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, that one of the challenges empires have is they become more and more dependent on these choke points around the world, and they become more and more expensive to police. And that's what we're doing now. There are about 5 or 6 major choke points in the world. I just did a piece on this on my Substack. They're harder and harder for us to police. We've policed them for the last 70 years, but they're harder to police because inexpensive drones and inexpensive missiles that the Houthis and the Iranians and others have can easily cause damage to our ships and other ships. The Houthis and the Iranians don't have to control the choke points. They just have to jeopardize ships going through them to make it really hard to manage them.
There's even a chance that your ship might get attacked. You're not going to send it through there.
The issue is an insurance company won't insure it. If your ship's not insured, you won't sail it.
And I read that edition of your newsletter, Democracy of Hope, and I was very happy to see there was a map at the top of it. What's one of my biggest complaints about history books is not enough maps.
I've learned that as a teacher because I've learned, I'm always astounded at how little my students know about geography and how important maps are for them.
1990s arrive, early 90s, Cold War's over. The United States comes out on top. George H.W. Bush, President of the United States, gives a televised address on Christmas Day, 1991.
The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
So we're in the early to mid-90s, the unipolar moment. What were the key illusions about that? Because it seemed, right, everything was going in our favor. Everything was going our way. But I think Paul Kennedy was still right. You could see the seeds of today's problems in those years.
The biggest problem, and you actually talked about this on other shows, was that Americans came to believe in the late 1991-92 period that we were immune from history, that history didn't matter, that it was an end of history, as Francis Fukuyama had written in 1989. And what did that mean for most Americans? It meant that, yeah, Paul Kennedy was right about other societies, but not us, that we were exceptional. We were different. This didn't apply to us. And people still say that. It's now extraordinary. Republicans who cared about debt when Obama was president now say debt doesn't matter because for the United States, we can go into debt and it doesn't matter. It matters for everyone else, but not for us. It's just not true. History matters to everyone. It does not repeat, but it doesn't go away.
Well, that's something that's so striking about when you revisit these years, how much politicians talked about the debt and how something had to be done about it.
Total debt of the United States This is where we began, $5.7 trillion in 2001. That's where the total debt of the United States stood when Mr. Bush came to office, a substantial sum, but every year that number went up and up and up to the point where when he left office a couple of weeks ago, the amount of debt stood at $10.7 trillion, nearly doubled in an 8-year period of time, from $5.7 trillion to $10.7 trillion. And as a consequence of that, we're feeling the effects of it in all sectors of our economy.
You know, I'm thumbing through the pages here of Paul Kennedy's book, his conclusion about, the problems facing the United States. And the one that comes up in all areas of the world that he's discussing is the difference or the gap, you might even call it a chasm, between our security commitments and what we're actually able to do. And he notes that when these commitments were undertaken, there were very good reasons for them. And this is even before, late 1980s, before there's more than one permanent military base in the Middle East. And he already says at this juncture that the United States is potentially overstretched in the Middle East. Take what he was saying then and compare it to what's been exposed over the past 2 months in the war against Iran.
Well, yeah, and I think this is a great place to close and bring this full circle, because what Paul was arguing was that every empire takes on commitments it cannot cover. You have to secure so many areas of the world. The larger you become, the more vulnerable you become, no matter how strong you are, right? And there's so many places where small groups can attack you. And so you have to defend all this area. And most of that defense is out of deterrence. You're deterring people from attacking you. But if you were attacked in all those areas, you could not cover them all.
That's right. He brings
the
up
Middle East
that,
is precisely this.
Yeah, he says it's unlikely the United States is going to have to defend all these places at the same time. But already we can see that we're moving stuff around. We're shifting assets. We just saw that over the past couple of months. The United States moving aircraft carriers from other parts of the world, from the Pacific all the way to the Middle East. But even so, the United States today was only being attacked in one area. Iran was firing missiles at the bases in the Middle East. We're not at war anywhere else, and still could not defend those bases in the Middle East. Is it time to bring those bases home?
Yes. I mean, the United States has, I think it's more than 700 military facilities around the world, and each of them is an extension of American power, but each of them is also an extension of American vulnerability. And we would be better now in a world where there are more peer competitors to make some really tough choices about places we care about and where we think we can act effectively. I think Western Europe is one of those places. The South China Sea is one of those places. And the Middle East, where we have never been effective and where we are so vulnerable, and where, quite frankly, we should be less dependent on those regions. And that's a choice we have to make. And I think that's one of the lessons from Paul's book, that empires cannot rule the world forever. They have to make choices.
Decline doesn't have to be feared. We can be a prosperous, happy country without bases in the Middle East.
Some of the happiest countries in the world, by most surveys, are some of the former empires, not current empires.
That's right. Well, are you saying Norway is jealous that they don't have bases that are being shot at? Bases in Qatar that are being shot at? I mean, we're laughing, but still, it's like one of these things. I mean, the whole framing of this conversation, right, is about, decline and no. But okay, in that sense, Donald Trump might be a world historical figure. He might be the one who actually brings the bases home, inadvertently.
We stand tonight before a new world of hope and possibilities for our children, a world we could not have contemplated a few years ago. The challenge for us now is to engage these new states in sustaining the peace and building a more prosperous future. And so today, based on commitments and assurances given to us by some of these states concerning nuclear safety, democracy, and free markets, I am announcing some important steps designed to begin this process. First, the United States recognizes and welcomes the emergence of a free, independent, and democratic Russia led by its courageous president, Boris Yeltsin.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, the first Palestinian uprising began in 1987, the second in 2000. But what about the Arab uprising during the British Mandate period of 1936? We'll explore its enduring consequences next as we report History as It Happens. Make sure to sign up for my free newsletter. Just go to Substack and search for History as It Happens.